Spring 1846. The United States prepares for war with Mexico. A war in which Mexico will surrender more than half her territory. During the conflict, hundreds of U.S. soldiers, many of them Irish immigrants, deserted from the army and joined forces with Mexico. Led by an Irishman, Captain John Riley, they called themselves the St. Patrick's Battalion, and they fought fiercely against the American forces. Many died in battle, and others were captured by the U.S. Army and punished. History has labeled them traitors and misfits who betrayed the flag of their newly adopted country. But others revere them as heroes. To this day, Mexicans honor them each year with a special ceremony. Mexicans are deeply convinced that the men they called the San Patricios came to their defense during Mexico's darkest hour. Even in Ireland, these soldiers are commemorated every year in September. And in the United States, they have made their way into a St. Patrick's Day parade. Who were the San Patricios? And what drove Captain John Riley and his men to change sides and fight for the cause of Mexico? To answer these questions, we need to look into the past. The story of these men begins in Ireland. By the mid-1800s, Ireland was the poorest country in Europe, racked by economic collapse, human misery, and famine. The seeds of exile were planted centuries earlier when Protestant England conquered Catholic Ireland and imposed a harsh penal code upon the defeated Irish Catholics. The penal laws denied the Irish their right to own land, the use of their native tongue, and the practice of their Catholic religion. But the Irish fought back, clinging steadfastly to their faith and culture. In 1798, the English crushed them militarily at a place called Vinegar Hill in County Wexford. But the struggle continued. In the early 1800s, a charismatic lawyer named Daniel O'Connell led a non-violent struggle to win civil liberties for Irish Catholics.
The point is that all of these political crusades involved hundreds of thousands and even millions of Catholics, rich and poor, throughout the island, and gave Ireland's Catholics a degree of political consciousness and a degree of political education and organizational ability and experience, which was very, very unusual in Western Europe at that time. And Ireland's Catholics brought this political consciousness and experience with them when they emigrated to the New World.
John Riley, who would later organize the St. Patrick's Battalion in Mexico, was from Galway, on Ireland's impoverished west coast. The soil there was so rocky that Riley's people planted their potatoes on beds of seaweed harvested from the ocean. In the 1840s, bad weather, the failure of the potato crop, and the cruel neglect of the British government compounded the problems of the Irish. James Hack Tuke, a British Quaker, recorded his eyewitness impressions of this tragedy.
I have visited the wasted remnants of the once noble red man and explored the Negro quarters of the enslaved Africans. But never have I seen misery so intense, or physical degradation so complete as among the dwellers of the bog holes of Ireland.
By the late 1830s, it was estimated by a parliamentary commission that as many as 3.5 out of Ireland's 8 million people were living in a state of absolute destitution, barely surviving from one year to the next on the produce of their potato crops. And when the potato crops failed, as they frequently did, then the people were reduced to absolute starvation.
Most of the land was owned by wealthy Protestants who settled in Ireland during the British conquests of the 17th century. But the overwhelming majority were Catholics who lived on the edge of starvation. When the Great Famine struck Ireland in 1845, it gave landlords the opportunity to evict their tenants by the thousands.
They would seize all of the valuable possessions which the farmers had, his livestock, for example, his furniture and what have you, and they would then level the cottage to the ground and try to make it impossible for the tenant farmer ever to return and to rebuild his home on the spot where he had lived.
As famine began to ravage the country, poor farmers and tenants from the west of Ireland, like John Riley, began to abandon their villages in record numbers. Emigration was their only escape from absolute destitution. Patrick Condon, a farmer, wrote in his diary,
I had seen strong men clothed in rags working for their masters, often without their fill of shriveled potatoes. I told myself I would die before I put up with that. So I decided to come to America.
John Riley and thousands like him swarmed to Ireland's port cities looking for a passage to America. United by family ties and their Catholic faith, they shared a deep resentment against their Protestant landlords and the British government. The voyages lasted for as long as 8 weeks. Food and water were scarce and disease was rampant. Riley left no record of his ocean crossing, but another traveler described such a voyage. Hundreds of poor people of all ages huddled together without light and air, wallowing in filth, sick in body and dispirited in heart. They lived without food or medicine, died without spiritual consolation, and were buried in the deep without the rites of the church. For those fortunate enough to arrive in good health, work was plentiful. Riley found employment on a farm in Mackinac, Michigan. Others labored as lumberjacks, blacksmiths, and pipe fitters. They dug canals and coal mines and built railroads. America needed immigrant labor, but looked upon the Irish as uncouth, dirty, and boisterous, and worst of all, Catholic. Magazines portrayed these newcomers as ne'er-do-wells with simian features.
Basically, it was a fear of the unknown, of all these immigrants who were coming over and who were somehow going to change what people who were born here saw as the character of America. A lot of it was simply prejudices that had been in this country from the very start of the English colonization. In other words, that age-old Protestant versus Catholic kind of sentiment. And the fact that there was so much antipathy towards the Irish made the Irish immigrants absolutely the prime targets of the nativists.
Philadelphia, 1844. The refusal of a Catholic school teacher to read from a Protestant Bible triggers a riot. A dozen people die in street clashes, and Protestant workers burn 2 Catholic churches.
The Catholic Church was regarded as a threat to America's democratic institutions and to the majority religion, Protestantism, of most Americans. And so consequently, Irish Catholics, who comprised the first great body of Catholics ever to reach American shores, were regarded almost as if they were subversives, as if they were the advance army of papal aggression.
Irish immigrants were caught up in America's westward expansion, a movement fueled by the doctrine of manifest destiny.
Well, manifest destiny was a religious doctrine. It was rooted in Calvinism, but rooted in also the Old Testament, where it was predestination. They came here. They looked at themselves as the Israelis, the Israelites coming into their promised land, and that God had predestined them to take over all of the land between the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the North Pole to the South Pole. And I think that it comes out with the Texas expansion.
From the beginning of the 19th century, the U.S. wanted to buy Mexico or take over its northern borderlands so that it could control the entire continent from coast to coast all the way to Central America. For decades, Anglo-American colonists had been pouring into Texas, Mexico's northern territory. In 1836, these settlers revolted against Mexican rule. The Texans suffered a serious setback at the Alamo, but later won independence from Mexico and statehood for Texas. But Texas was only the beginning. 10 years later, President James Knox Polk tried to purchase California and other territories from Mexico. Mexico refused to sell. Frustrated by this, and by Mexico's refusal to pay its debts to the U.S., Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor and his troops to march through the Rio Grande.
Every document that I have seen, American documents, U.S. documents who are, very pro the war, I'll admit that this was a fishing expedition. There was an expedition that was sent down there to provoke a war. And in fact, Polk himself, James Polk, the President of the United States, had he had his speech almost written to declare war with Mexico.
In April 1846, the Mexicans ambushed one of Taylor's patrols, killing several soldiers. Taylor sent an urgent message to President Polk. Hostilities may now be considered as commenced. Polk declared war on May 13th, insisting that American blood had been shed on American soil. Volunteers swarmed to the recruitment stations. Among them were thousands of newly arrived immigrants. Some joined the army for the pay. Others saw Mexico as a glorious adventure.
Since I crossed the hill and o'er the moor and valley, such heavy thoughts my heart do fill, since parting from my Sally. I seek no more the fine and gay, for each does but remind me how swiftly the hours did pass away with the girl I left behind me.
John Riley had enlisted months earlier in Michigan and was sent to join General Zachary Taylor's forces in Corpus Christi, Texas. A soldier's life in this war was grim. Even before the troops reached the Rio Grande, disease broke out, aggravated by contaminated water and food. More than 1,000 of Taylor's men died of dysentery and typhus. Then there was the brutality of the officers against the enlisted men.
For the slightest infractions of not saluting properly, a soldier had to carry a heavy weight around for all day long in the hot sun, or he might be whipped, and they had flogging. For getting drunk, they sometimes branded a HD on their forehead or on their cheek for habitual drunkard.
Irish and other immigrant soldiers felt singled out for these kinds of abuses.